taking the conference ahead, ICAI Sakshi Jain would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to our next panel discussion that is on future-ready professionals. For this, we have with us today very learned personalities as speakers to guide us through. Now, I would like to call upon our eminent speakers on the dais. Please welcome Ms. Joy Thomas, President and CEO, CPA Canada. Dr. Gary, Head of Policy and Advocacy, CPA Australia. CA Nilesh S. Vikamsey, Past President, ICAI. CA Bhavna Doshi, Past Council Member, ICAI. Now, I request CA Bhavna Doshi ma'am to take over the session.
Hello. Thank you, Sakshi, and a very good afternoon to all of you. After this powerful session on what's new for chartered accountants and the opportunities that we spoke of, we now move to the session of future-ready professionals. And when we say future-ready, what we are talking of is what is in store for us in future. When we talk of future, we are talking of what's going to happen. It's crystal ball gazing, but we have to think of it as to what's likely to happen. And when we are preparing ourselves, what we need to understand is how are things going to change. We are today talking about the fourth industrial revolution, rather super industrial revolution. We are talking of the new economy. And in all of this, the way the businesses are run, the business models are likely to undergo change. With that, they will face new challenges. When they face new challenges, their requirements will change. The stakeholders' expectations will change. And within that, how do we prepare ourselves to remain ahead and remain relevant? And that's what we will discuss today. We have a very powerful panel today who have global experience and very specialized experience of two countries, Canada as well as US. Canada, Joy brings that. And we have Gary, who brings in the Australian and the New Zealand experience. And of course, we have our own Nilesh, who brings in the Indian experience. So with all of that, let us start straight away with the discussion. So Gary, if I first come to you, as to what is your perception? How do you see the new models for business developing?
Thank you very much, Bhavna, and thank you very much to the ICAI for the invitation to be at the conference and to speak to you all. It's great to be back in Mumbai again. When you look at business and you look at, say, the trends in the future and the future models, I immediately think of three topics that have already been touched on today. So in some ways, I'm just going to reiterate some of the things we've heard. But I think the three biggest impacts will be the impacts of technology, the impacts of globalization and or geopolitics, if you like, and the impacts of what you might call the trust deficit. How important it is to be trusted, what that means, who you trust in and who trusts you. And I'm going to refer to something that Alan, the Deputy President of IFAC, mentioned this morning. You mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer. And in the 2019 barometer that was released, there was questions asked about fears of job loss. What are the issues that employees feel are most threatening to their jobs? And I thought it was really interesting that 60% of employees of multinational firms talk about automation and other innovations taking their jobs away. 64%, so nearly two-thirds, talked about international conflicts about trade policies and tariffs hurting the company they work for. So I thought that was really interesting. That means that, you know, technology as was mentioned this morning, is going to impact the way we do business, and moreover, it's going to impact the profession, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later. But CPA Australia recently published some research that we did looking at the impacts of technology, and a couple of interesting things that came out of it was that we shouldn't look at it or look upon technology with fear. We should be looking at it from the point of view of we can control how we use technology. It will impact the way we do things. And rather than what the barometer says about losing jobs, what we found was it will change the way things are done. Tasks will change, not necessarily entire roles. And so that will impact the way business operates. I think in terms of the geopolitical environment, and it was mentioned this morning that we've had a period of globalisation. Everyone was supportive of globalisation. I think there's recognition that worldwide it has probably been a very good thing. However, the benefits of that globalisation haven't extended equally across all nations or across all people within those nations. So I think when we look at how that'll impact business, with growing nationalism, people sort of becoming a bit more introverted, looking at their own situation, that'll impact the way that people look on how they'll, say, expand, the way they'll operate. Will you bring in new labour from overseas? How will you share data across borders and so on? And again, if you link it back to the profession, I know we'll talk about later, but the importance of the profession being a global profession that has international standards for financial reporting, auditing, ethics is really important to business, to make sure that businesses can effectively operate across borders. And the last comment I'll just make on trust, I thought it was really interesting that the Edelman Trust Barometer looks at people's perceptions of how much they trust important institutions, governments, business, media, and non-government organisations. And looking at the 2019 results are really fascinating. Alan mentioned this morning that although there's been an increase in trust overall, the general population is still distrustful of government and media, but there's a stronger level of trust in employers and business. So that's really encouraging, I think, for businesses to look at that and think, okay, we have an important role to play. Excuse me, employees are trusting us. And I just extracted one page. I thought it was interesting because we have Joy from Canada and Nilesh from India and myself. The barometer looks at 26 countries, and those countries' overall trust of those institutions. For India, you're up there in third place. You still have a lot of trust for those institutions. Canada moved in 2018 from being distrustful to being neutral. So you're becoming more trusting, but not quite there. I don't know whether I'm embarrassed to say, but Australia was right down the bottom in both 18 and 19, in that we don't have a high level of trust for those institutions at all. And so when you think about that, that really impacts business in the way you would do business across borders, in the way that people perceive what they think about the government, the role that they play, the media and other organisations.
Thank you, Gary. It was excellent summarization of how the business models are going to be changing, what is going to impact that, the technology, the trust deficit, and so on. So, Nilesh, do you feel that given these changes in the business models which we are seeing, what are the challenges that the businesses will really see? Because given these challenges or the new models which are coming in, they will see a lot of challenges, and that would decide on where we need to focus on.
Hello, can you hear me? Thanks. Gary, first of all, I don't know where the statistics of trust came from. We have just had some episodes on the corporate sector after Satyam, some huge failures last year, and which is, of course, the ILFS failure has created, again, a trust deficit in the institutions, but be that as it may, I would still rely on them. Now, coming to your question on the challenges which the business are facing, I would just list out a few. First and foremost is the velocity of change is huge, the pace of change, whether it's technology, whether it is regulation. I think three factors which Gary mentioned, technology, geopolitical, and trust. I would add two more factors in that. One is, of course, I'm saying from the India perspective, I don't know what's happening in the other parts of the world, but the general feeling of over-regulation, the pendulum of regulation from self-regulation or business regulating itself. Again, here the trust factor comes in, whether the governments are trusting the businesses in India. There's a general feeling that the trust deficit is there of the government in the businesses, and hence the regulation, overall regulatory regime is going to the other side of the pendulum. The fifth one, of course, is the disruption. I think not only the technology disruption, the business disruption is huge. The acceleration of the innovation. One is the disruption and the innovation which is happening across products and services. I think the rate at which is happening is absolutely unbelievable. So we are getting better products, better services at a very, very fast rate. So these are the challenges which existing businesses have to sort of cope with. Along with this, the impact of technology is, the challenges which is facing is I would say the redundancy of the skill sets which we have, the existing jobs are changing, the skill mismatches, for example, let's take a profession. We need more professionals from a technology background, but we are more accountants, but we'll need to, look at more technology background people with us. Then we're looking at the challenges of potential job losses with the businesses that the government also is facing, despite unemployment across countries. Technology is bringing in AI, robotics, is displacing human, with machines. So that's, again, a challenge. Then the challenge of data privacy, data security. These are the challenges, I think, and the business model changing because of innovation and disruption. It is all the models, and they're changing very, very quickly. So that's broadly, I think, the challenges which the business are facing.
Joy, would you like to add to that, supplement the challenges that you foresee, whether in the business model or in the challenges that the businesses are facing? And in that context, are the expectations of the stakeholders changing? We spoke about regulation. We spoke about trust. So perhaps the expectation of the stakeholders, be they the regulators, be it government, be it society at large, be it the shareholders, are their expectations from businesses and the profession, consequently, are changing? Do you see that happening?
Yes, absolutely. Can everyone hear me? Okay, yes. First, I'd like to just say it's a pleasure to be here in India and in Mumbai at your conference, and I can't believe what a dedicated audience we have here. You've just been sitting through and just really engaged, so thank you. So, yeah, I mean, businesses are definitely experiencing a lot of challenges, and I think that one of the problems here is that, we're going through this rapid pace of change with technology in particular, but certainly many other drivers of change impacting the world and impacting business. But many of the world's systems have been designed for the industrial age. And so, when you look at all of the systems around the world and then you think about all of these disruptors, whether it's climate change and severe weather events and the impacts that they're having on businesses and on society, whether it's something as simple, or not as simple, but something like geopolitical issues. We've got this situation where we've got these systems that are not really designed to react as quick enough as they can. They're not really designed to capture the amount of data that's coming at them in greater and greater amounts. And that in and of itself, I think, is causing more disruption in the system as businesses are really challenged to transform themselves in the midst of this fourth industrial revolution that we're facing. But in terms of the needs of stakeholders then at the same time, they're definitely changing. And stakeholders and society, employees, they're all expecting much, much more from organizations. Whether organizations can or should deliver these changing expectations is up for debate. But certainly, for example, we're looking for more long-termism, a more long-term view than short-term reporting. We're looking at more responsibility towards the impacts on the environment that organizations are having. And then that all plays into, well, how do we design the systems and the frameworks that would enable us to actually report on a much more holistic type of organizational performance than in the past, which has been only on financial information. And so, yes, in that regard, I think stakeholders' expectations are changing and organizations are struggling to keep up with those demands.
Thank you. So, considering this particularly in India, we do feel, and as Nilesh, you mentioned, that there is overreach by the regulators. The expectations are completely different. And when we even go to judiciary, we find that their expectations from profession are different. So if I were to ask each one of you, that is it that now globally, whether in your country or in India, elsewhere, are the regulators or government expecting, or the society, expecting us to be bloodhounds, which we always believed we are not? That's not our role. But is there now the expectation? So, Gary, may I start with you?
Yeah, when I think of expectations, if I can use an example from Australia, that last year we revised our stock exchange corporate governance principles. So companies that are listed on the stock exchange need to comply with these principles on a comply or explain basis. And we had a very lengthy discussion about whether those principles should include the notion of a social license to operate. And it was going to the point, Joy, that you were talking about, the societal expectations. And there was a lot of discussion and debate about, is it appropriate for that to be included in the principles when, under our Corporations Act, the shareholder still has primacy in terms of the responsibility of the directors. And the debate went along the lines of, well, and I think, Alan, you alluded to this morning as well, are we just focused too much on shareholders versus the broader stakeholders? And when you start looking at the broader stakeholders, you start thinking about things like integrated reporting and the 6 capitals. You start thinking about the work that the OECD has done on responsible business conduct. In Australia, we have introduced laws around modern slavery and reporting and disclosure around modern slavery in line with that responsible business conduct. And people were saying, but if you are fulfilling the needs and responsibilities of the shareholders, but you look at it over a longer term, that means you need to, by necessity, look at the broader stakeholder environment. And it was really interesting that comes down to, what does society expect? What do politicians expect? What do the media expect? What do the public at large expect? And it was really interesting that after a lot of discussion, we didn't end up including them in the corporate governance principles. So we still don't have this notion of social license to operate, although I think the good thing was there was a lot of media attention given to it. There was a lot of public debate. And so it puts that little bit of pressure on business to make sure that they still consider that very important aspect when they operate. And so I think that's a good example in Australia of where we've had those expectations increasing, if you like, and impacting the way that business operates.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bhavna. Whether an auditor is a bloodhound or a watchdog, I think that has been an age-old, I would say, phenomenon. But I think more and more the expectation is that once the financial statements or any certificate is signed by an auditor, there should be no error. That's the general perception, society's perception, government's perception, right or wrong. And somehow I think we whether in India or whether globally, have not been able to bridge the expectation gap, the difference between what is an audit and what is an investigation. And unfortunately today, what's happening is hindsight wisdom of investigative, techniques is being used to judge the audit profession, which in my view is not very good. Having said that, the difference between skepticism and investigation, I think there's a huge difference. But possibly, I think it's for the profession also for us to introspect whether we need to go a notch up from the skepticism which we are following for audits. May not be full investigation, but that's, I think, for all of us to brainstorm and debate what we need to do. Another thing which I'm finding in the Indian scenario is, of course, earlier I think we, as a profession, used to do almost everything, whether it's income tax, GST, audit, and huge volumes of work, little bit errors here and there, were sort of overlooked. But today, the whole regulatory environment, and across, whether it's an income tax, whether it's a Companies Act, whether it's audit, I think there is no room for any error. The chalta hai culture is absolutely not acceptable. We are seeing the type of penalties or the late filing fees or whatever, maybe you name it, the quantums have gone up so much. So quality in whatever we do, I think, has to be the ethos. Like, we cannot have lack of quality in any work which we are doing. I think that's one, focus on quality has to be there. So volume versus quality, I think it's being weighed more in towards the quality now. So maybe even at the cost of reducing some volume of work. If quality is getting affected, I think we need to focus back on quality.
Would you like to add something?
Oh, I'm always ready to add something. Yeah, I just want to there is always this dialogue about the expectation of the audit and, will auditors be expected to be bloodhounds? And I think, just stepping back for a minute, we know, and Gary, you mentioned it, about just this growing distrust in information and in institutions generally. But I was struck this morning, Alan mentioned about, there you are, Alan's still there, just with such passion about the role that accountants actually play in economies. And I think we forget that sometimes, accountants can save the planet. And we all believe that, I hope, quite strongly. Accounting and auditing are really the guardians of resource and capital allocation. And quite frankly, if we don't have accurate and trustworthy information, then the economies and the sustainability of the planet and society is at stake. That's how critical it is. And so I think then, if we think that a key product of the work that we do as accountants is trust, and the future of the profession is premised on the fact that CAs or CPAs are really the stewards of public trust. And so I say all of that because I think we have an obligation as a profession to really listen to what stakeholders are telling us. There is an expectation gap, and we have to change the conversation from being about how we educate on that gap to how we actually close that gap. And I think that it's a very difficult conversation, but by bringing together all of the stakeholders in the ecosystem, I think that's where our focus should be. What can we do to change the audit product and the role of auditors? And when you think about technology and the role that technology can play in that regard, we know that it can be a key driver when you look at artificial intelligence and audit data analytics to really, obviously not detect all fraud, but certainly to do some work to advance what we can uncover and to somehow perhaps close that expectation gap. I think it's just important that we remember that. And as the custodians of trust, we have an obligation, and I would say actually a huge opportunity in that regard.
Yeah, please.
Joy, you just made me think of something when you were talking about closing that expectations gap. And I think I agree totally with you that we should be looking at how we close the gap rather than expect that continuing education will make people all of a sudden realize what an audit is. And I think the use of technology is a really important part of that. But I also just wonder, when you look at what's happening in the UK with the Bryden Review, In Australia, we have a parliamentary joint committee inquiry into the regulation of auditing going on at the moment. And people are starting to question the scope of the audit, because when you think about it, the scope hasn't really changed much for, well, 50, 70 years perhaps. And people are starting to question, well, if the public do expect that the auditors talk about, say, going concern, or do look into fraud in a different way, or do look at things other than just financial statements, should we be looking at whether we need to change the scope? Maybe the standard setters, maybe the IAASB need to look at that and say, is an audit of financial statements as we've known it for so long really fit for purpose and meeting those expectations? And I think these reviews that are ongoing at the moment will raise those questions.
Very interesting perspective, because as we see, so far as businesses are concerned, the expectations of society from business are also changing. It's no longer only profit, the bottom line. They're also looking at the impact that the business creates on the society, on the environment, and how are they governed. These are the three aspects on which value is assigned to business. And if these are the aspects on which businesses are going to be evaluated, obviously the auditors will need to step in and say, yes, these are the areas where we can report on. And that's what we are talking about, integrated reporting and audit of that integrated reporting. So perhaps what we are talking of is, and as all the panelists mentioned, we're looking at change because of the expectation gap, and that gap needs to be reduced. We need the businesses, government, and the stakeholders to understand what we can and what we cannot do, and how can we move a little forward and provide that assurance with the society and all the other stakeholders are looking at from us. And that means we need to think through as to what we can do. How can we prepare ourselves to meet those challenges, the expectation changes? Because if we do not change, it means we will become irrelevant. We may become redundant. And for that, maybe like some people do ask question that if we have to report on environmental impact, are we competent? Is our education enough to enable us to report on that? Perhaps we may have collaborations, which would then enable us to provide that assurance or comment on the report that a company has presented. Given that context, Joy, if I may come to you, what do you think our professionals, as we ourselves, need to learn, understand, and what can institutions like ICAI or yours in Canada can do to help members, one, reducing the gap, and secondly, preparing them for being ready to report?
Yeah, okay. There's a lot there. Let me think about how to unpack that. I think number one is it's all about data now, and how we are going to leverage data. You know, we're living in this incredible data-driven world. There's just this unbelievable amount of real-time information that is coming at us, and it's making traditional quarterly reporting and gap measures relatively irrelevant as an assessment of value. And so I think as a profession, we have to get our heads around a little bit the opportunity to provide assurance and trust in information that goes far beyond financial information and starts to consider a much broader range of sources. And we know, we've heard about this already today, that traditional financial statements just are not covering where the value is, what's really driving value in organizations. I mean, less than 20% now probably are what investors are looking at on those financial statements versus all kinds of other intangible types of information, whether it's innovation, people, brand, data, trust, sustainability, metrics, etc. And so, you know, for us to get our heads around that in a different way, we've got investors now that are using big data in ways that they can predict different trends within organizations sometimes before management even knows about them. And as those types of models continue to mature over the next several years, one does wonder what our profession is doing auditing financial statements at all, or the relevancy of financial statements. So I think for us, it's about trying to understand how we are going to be estimating some of these more elusive types of value. And today, we would say, well, they're hard to measure, but hard to measure is not going to cut it anymore. I think we have an obligation and an opportunity as a profession to understand how to value those intangibles and to understand the frameworks and standards, et cetera, that can be put in place so that organizations can use them and we can provide assurance over them.
Yeah, Nilesh, I think a lot of new opportunities, as Joy is mentioning.
Of course, from a profession perspective, I think what we need to do is, as you rightly said, Bhavna, whether it is on the integrated reporting, whether knowing new subjects, and more, I think the focus apart from this has to be on the technology. I think somehow, despite our focus on technology for a number of years, we're still not embraced technology to the extent required. And if you ask currently what we know, just to extrapolate from what Joy mentioned, I think data science and data analytics is one area where if the institute could sort of support members also, and we as members also can sort of look at, that's going to be the future. How do we, the data analytics and the data science part of it. And from an, again, ICAI perspective, how do we, sort of have more software and tools, easy to use tools for various activities, whether it is data analytics, whether it's forensic. We do have courses on forensic and all. My view, Bhavna, is the way we are doing normal statutory audit, I think will become like a dinosaur, will get extinct. Maybe 10 years, 15 years down the line, forensic audit will be the new norm, which will be the new audit. So I think whether we are equipped as individual members or as collectively as a profession, and what the institute can do in that direction. Our president is here, and I think all the council colleagues are here. And we are doing a wonderful job as far as we have started the course on forensic audit, etc., FAFD. But how do we expand the reach? How do we make members take that and have focus on these areas? I think that will be a good, plus a knowledge portal where knowledge access by the common members, by the small and medium practitioners could be easy in the day-to-day, practice areas. I think that could be another focus area where we're doing, but I think we need to do more.
Yeah, so effectively, besides the normal assurance that we give, which would be more like because of automation and artificial intelligence and whatnot, we would really look at the systems, perhaps the systems audit. So that's one, whether it's accounted in the way the standards require it to be accounted. So are the financial statements prepared and presented in accordance with the standards? One aspect. And the second would perhaps be forensic, the additional part of it. And then there would be, in addition, perhaps reporting on the environment and social impact and the governance for the organization as a whole. Very interesting perspective, and lots of, therefore, new opportunities, of course, will require a lot of change, mindset change to start with, and then working with the regulators, with government, with the society to make them understand the new changes which are coming in, and then what are the steps we are taking to prepare ourselves. Gary would...
Sorry, with your permission, just want to add. So the way the technology is impacting us, I think... the way we are doing substantive checking, I'm saying from an audit perspective, I think these days are numbered. You look, we are using Uber right from the booking the cab till the payment. Everything is technology. And this is going to happen. We will say today Uber is a large company, but this app business, even the smallest of the small entity is going to be more and more app-based. Whether we as a profession, whether it's a small practice or a large practice, are we equipped to do an audit where the audit trail itself is not very effective? I think these are basic things where I think possibly the larger part of the profession, which has been used to an older way of looking at things, substantive procedures, vouching, etc. So that change, I think, is there, absolutely on our horizon, and we need to be very fast in changing ourselves.
Gary, would you like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Bhavna. I actually have 2 points that come to mind, and one was, what do we do as professional organisations to try and also influence tertiary and university education where the principles of accounting are taught. And we have an annual lecture at CPA Australia that it holds in conjunction with the University of Melbourne, and this year was the 80th annual presentation, and it was done by a professor from the US, and he gave a very simple example of how we're not using technology or data analytics at the university level when we teach students the principles of accounting. He used a very simple example of a debtor schedule, an aging debtor schedule. So we know when we're coming up with our figure for allowance for doubtful debts, and I'm sure probably all of you out there were taught this at university when you did it. How did you do it? You'd say, okay, this has been outstanding for 10 days, there's a 5% chance it'll default. 10 to 30 days, there's a 20% chance of default. Over 30, it might be 50%, so on. So you apply your percentages, you add it up. And this professor said, why are we still teaching that? The principle of why we make an allowance is fine. But in today's day and world, we have so much data out there that companies are publishing on their website, putting through social media. We have a wealth of information about the economy, about industries and so on. Why are we teaching students still an aging debtor schedule rather than go out there and see what data is available, and for every one of your debtors come up with a probability and assign that? So I think as a profession we need to go back beyond when people come to us to do the qualification, to say, when we're teaching the principles, how do we teach them? And the second thing that comes to mind, and it was something that you mentioned, Bhavna, about the need to continually adapt and change. And I'm not sure how we do it, but I think one of the things that we should be doing as professional organisations is skilling up people to be able to change. You know, it takes a certain skill to be able to recognise that your thinking is perhaps old-fashioned or outdated. It takes a skill to be able to look at something new and say, how can we utilise that to our advantage, to make things better, to make things more efficient? And maybe it fits into this notion of sort of ethics and behaviour and governance, but how do we skill people up to be able to progress and adapt to changes as they're confronted with them? And I think, Nilesh, you even mentioned about the outdated and what the older members of the profession like us think about the way things should be done, but we should be teaching people to say, well, how do we change that? How do we do things differently?
Thank you. One more aspect, and moving away from auditing and assurance, a lot of us in India are also engaged in taxation services, Gary and Joy. So we do a lot of tax work from very small organizations to large organizations. We also have audits under tax, whether it's direct or indirect. And we see a lot of changes happening there with digitization. A significant part of the work which we used to do a few years ago has disappeared. And that's a question in minds of several people as to what do we do now? We are now no longer required to do the return filing, which we were used to doing. It's all automated now. With the e-assessment, even the assessments will now not require so much of personal involvement. So we would have a lot of time at our hands. And how do we utilize that effectively? What do we do? How do we change? What are the new areas we can look at?
Can I take that?
Yes.
Yes, somebody earlier on today said the ability to learn, unlearn, and relearn.
Yes.
And that's something we certainly are paying attention to in Canada and within our program. Actually, we're calling it revolutionizing the learning continuum right from the beginning of your program through to your retirement is really the time frame you have to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And look at, I mean, you know, manual routine jobs are going to be automated. They are being automated. And, you know, it's our professional obligation to make sure that we're maintaining competence for jobs that will add value. And those jobs are not adding value. And so for us, we need to consider what are the more higher order skills and the more enabling skills that professional accountants need to have. And Gary, you spoke to some of them, and I would certainly say resilience, building resilience into professional accountants so that they can adapt and change as they need to, and they can navigate change within their organizations. The value that we are adding is not related to transactional routine items. It is related to how we are actually helping organizations to perform better by helping them to solve complex business problems. And we do that with those higher order skills, the ability to think critically, our emotional intelligence, how much of that we have, our communication skills, our ability to tell the story of an organization in a compelling way. And those are many of the skills that we are focusing on in our program. And to Gary, to your point again, reducing, which gives a lot of people pause, but reducing the technical content, because you can get technical content from a bot sitting on your desk. And so I think that's where we need to go, so that professional accountants are not worrying about transactional accounting. They're not worrying about losing their jobs to that, but they're actually saying, how can we leverage this technology in a way that continue to add value to our organization and drive performance?
Brilliant. I think that's what we've been doing at the Institute. Perhaps you may like to add.
I want to add a few things. Of course, nothing more than, see what is happening in the Indian scenario are SMPs, the small and medium practitioners. They're doing tax, they're doing GST, they're doing audit. In tax, I think we are getting huge support now in the softwares where I think you just fill up the data and you get your capital gains, all the complicated capital gains statements that is coming out of the system, where earlier we used to do it manually. And time is not far away when the Central Board of Direct Taxes will start extracting information from the stock exchanges, and you'll get a pre-populated capital gains statement and whatever it may be. Even the GST network and income tax network are being integrated. So data which is there, the revenue data and all. So a lot of it will have a pre-populated, fields coming up. My suggestion to these small and medium practitioners who are watching this here in the NCP or outside is, whatever time you're saving out of the more, harnessing the technology or the software available, please focus on the audits. Currently, you're seeing in the Indian landscape, the larger audits being questioned, whether it is an ILFS or a DHFL, and the time is not far away when the smaller audits will also will be questioned. And how much time we are focusing on the documentation and a lot of other things. So a piece of caution to the members here is, today what is happening completely is a perception value. Today we have got, say, the United Breweries of Vijay Mallya. Anybody associated around with that, even professionals, are being questioned, even if they have done nothing wrong. They've done their job, I would say reasonably okay. A lot of hindsight wisdom being used to look at their work. So whoever is doing audit in the SMP area, whatever time you're saving out of use of technology on the tax area, please deploy, enhance your audit, focus in whatever manner you can by documentation. Please, whichever clients are not in from a KYC perspective, the right type of clients, please get dissociated. In the morning we heard Padma Shri Manoharan talking about resignations. Please do that before you come under focus. So it's better to be safe than sorry. That's what is said. So that's thank you.
Gary, would you like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Bhavna. I think when you look at technology and the impact it'll have on the profession, I mentioned earlier the research that we'd recently published at CPA Australia, and what we found was that it seems like a lot of the technology that is being introduced, whether it's AI, data analytics, blockchain, robotic process automation, which is what we looked at, it won't totally do away with a whole job. It'll do away with tasks, and it'll still leave an element of jobs that have to then be either combined with other jobs or reformed or reshaped. And the important thing about it was there will always be this element of the context within which that technology is used, because RPA, robotic process automation, is merely a piece of software. So somebody has to write that program, create that software within a certain context, and know how to change it. When you've got accounts payable processing being done by RPA, and there's a change to tax laws, well, that software has to be rewritten and that processing has to change. But moreover, and again, I keep talking, Alan, about your presentation this morning, but another important element is the ethics side of technology. And the research that we did looked at it in two ways. One was the data confidentiality, privacy, and that aspect. But the other part was, when you think about artificial intelligence and how that is how that's created, it's based on thousands, millions, or whatever, previous decisions, previous actions, and decisions and outcomes. And people say, well, that's great because artificial intelligence will be able to make much better informed decisions because they can draw on these hundreds of millions of previous experiences. But what if those hundreds of millions of previous experiences are all based on a middle-aged white man living in a Western society? You know, that might mean that that decision or the outcome from that AI is not going to be relevant to a whole lot of other situations around the world. And so there's that ethical dimension there, or if it's all based on a male's view, is that right? You know, does it represent 50% of the population? And so there's always going to be this human element involved, and accountants are very good at, you know, risk management, governance and ethics. And so there is going to always be a role, I think, in technology in that regard for the profession.
Nilesh, you want to add?
I don't want to add, just want to, I believe we are sort of closing, we are running out of time. Just two things for the audience over here. It is just a strange coincidence that the people sitting on the dais, other than Bhavna, the way we have got the challenge of NFRA, the fact that the profession feels that we should, the profession to regulate the profession, something similar is happening at the IFAC level, at the international level, where there is a move to move out the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board and the Ethical Standards Board out of IFAC. And the person sitting to my left, Gary, he has been like a rock-solid person at that point of time when Rachel Grimes was the president of IFAC, who was sort of working on how to sort of, on the challenge as far as explaining to the monitoring group, the public interest oversight group. Joy and myself were in the advisory committee advising Rachel. So it's just a strange coincidence, and it's really good. And before concluding, I just want to, the topic today which we had, the future-ready professionals. I want to give a quote of Philip Knight, who's the former CPA and the founder of Nike. There comes a time in every life when the past recedes and the future opens. It's that moment when you turn to face the unknown. Some will turn back to what they already know. Some will walk straight ahead into uncertainty. I can't tell you which one is right, but I can tell you which one is more fun. Thank you.
Wonderful. Beautiful summation. I was originally hoping that we'll take 2-3 comments from the audience, but we are absolutely out of time. So thank you very much, all of you, for this opportunity. And we had wonderful discussion. Thank you, Joy, Gary, and Nilesh. And just to sum up, focus on value addition. If I were to just sum up in 2 words, what everyone is saying is times are changing, the businesses are changing, expectations are changing. So be prepared to change, be ready to change, and look at where you can add value. That's what will count ultimately. So thank you all for this.
Thank you to all the speakers for such a wonderful deliberation and enlightening the House with their knowledge. I would now request CA Dayanivas Sharma to present a memento to Honorable Mrs. Joy Thomas. I would request CA Aniket Talati to present a memento to Honorable Dr. Gary. I would like to request CA Jay Chhera to present a memento to Honorable CA Nilesh S. Vikamsey. I would like to request CA Sanjeev Singhal to present a memento to Honorable CA Bhavna Doshi. Again, request everyone to give a huge round of applause to all the speakers. I now hand over the mic to CA Charmi Shah to carry on with the next session.